They had become all-powerful courtiers in an age of reason. Their methods were being used to build a better world in America. As their power increased, so did their ambitions. Their techniques, they said, could even predict the future.
Control, 20% probability. 0, 1, yes, here's the unlikely event that became true, and I just go on through the others the same way.
This is not a crap game. It's a serious game. Rolling the dice is Dr. Olaf Helmer of the RAND Corporation. He is conducting a simulation exercise. A panel of experts has studied a list of possible 21st century developments, from personality-controlled drugs to household robots. They have estimated the numerical probability of each. The current fascination of a new intellectual breed, the futurists.
So we wind up with a world which has the following features. We have fertility control, 100-year lifespan, controlled thermonuclear power, continued automation, genetic control, man-machine symbiosis, household robots, wideband communications, opinion control, and continued urbanization.
I would guess in 100 and certainly less than 200 years, if things go at all well, 90-95% of the world's people will be living at higher than current American standards of living. You know, men will go from everywhere poor, everywhere in danger of hunger, starvation, to a life in which the technology largely insulates you from nature.
But at the very moment when the men from RAND were promising America a utopia, their whole approach was about to meet its nemesis. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson began a bombing campaign of North Vietnam. The targets were chosen for their psychological value, pawns in a game of persuading the communists to withdraw from the South. It was inspired by the work of RAND's leading exponent of game theory, Thomas Schelling.
It was a war in which we were attempting to intimidate an enemy into discontinuing what he was doing, in which it was believed that if you made it painful enough for the North Vietnamese, they would call off their campaign. So I think there may have been plenty in my writings that people thought applied to this kind of war, because this was a vicious, violent bargaining process. And the effort was to convince the other side that we could tolerate more pain and damage than they could.
But the communists did not behave in a rational way and retreat. Reluctantly, the strategists in the Pentagon agreed to send thousands of American troops to Vietnam.
Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die! Glory, glory, what a hell of a way to die!
By now, the systems and numbers approach dominated the Pentagon. McNamara's whiz kids were convinced that the battle against the Viet Cong could be managed in a rational, scientific way. Indeed, they could see no other way.
The problem with the Vietnam War was that it was not a war for territory. What American policymakers needed, what the Pentagon needed, was some way of how do you tell if we're winning or not? In the absence of being able to take Hanoi or something like that, they had to find other indicators. And what came out of that was a whole array of statistics. It ranged from the body count down to number of missions flown, tonnage of bombs dropped, number of enemy structures destroyed, tonnage of food captured from the enemy.
This is a chart that was used by one of the think tanks to demonstrate how to neutralize an enemy village, showing a flow of how action can be taken to neutralize enemy force. Is this village loyal to the belligerent? Consider the next village. Is this village loyal to the opponent? No. Based on reliable information, what does this village perceive as its major problem? It's almost like a game of Monopoly, isn't it? To Mr. McNamara and his brain trust of whiz kids, this was probably equal to the U.S. Constitution. It was the ultimate document.
If one thinks of political and military aggression,
I will tell you, for example, that long sessions that we used to have on Vietnam, when McNamara would be urging a certain measure, And the president would say, well, Bob, what do you think the chances of success are? Oh, he would say, I think it's 55% and 45% failure. And I would speak up and say, Bob, are you sure it isn't 47% and 42%? You know, I mean, this was a frame of mind. And nothing was ever expressed except in quantitative terms as far as McNamara was concerned, and he spoke for the whole Defense Department.
Let me give you an example of the way the numbers worked. I happened to be on a patrol in late spring, early summer of 1967, where we observed a Vietnamese national some hundreds of meters away from us, running away from us. And standard procedure at that time was you could fire on anybody running away from you. When we got to the body, we discovered that it was an unarmed, older woman, 55, 60 years old. And in the intelligence summary that I prepared the next day, I put in exactly what happened. By the time that report reached the division level, that dead woman had become an ageless, genderless Viet Cong with a Chinese Communist grenade. And these numbers, these reports, these statistics directly obscured the reality and presented a picture that was 180 degrees removed from reality. And yet when you take all those numbers and dump them in the Pentagon, those guys sit there and they count up the numbers and they can go, we're winning.
In 1967, Robert McNamara resigned in failure. Before he went, he made a speech in Montreal. He ended it by asking, who is man? Is he a rational animal? If he is, then the goals can be achieved. But if he isn't, then there is little point in making the effort. McNamara had been the patron of the strategists. Without him, much of their power disappeared. They and their think tanks became targets for the mass protests against the war.
Hundreds of people protested and marched up the driveway and planted crosses in the front yard of the Institute. And it made me and many of us here very angry, because they were making assumptions about what we thought, and they wouldn't even check.
They thought we were warmongers up here. There's no question about that.
They offered us jobs to go other places. When we would leave the driveway for lunch, they'd stop and offer us jobs if we'd leave Hudson Institute. None of us ever did.
America's politicians had originally been attracted to the strategists because they promised a rational, controllable world. But in Vietnam, their methods had been used to create a fiction. The scientific approach had been corrupted to preserve the politicians' power.